Every person who grew up with the name of Judas Iscariot lodged in the back of their mind as the definition of ultimate betrayal was handed that story by a tradition that had already made a decisive choice, centuries before you were born, about which texts you would be allowed to read and which ones would be buried so deep in the Egyptian desert that they would not surface again for 1700 years. The version of Judas you received is not the only version that existed in early Christianity. It is the version that survived a selection process. And the Gospel of Judas, the text that tells the other side of that story, says something about the crucifixion that changes the entire architecture of what you were taught. Somewhere in the back of your mind, the Judas story has probably always carried a faint discomfort you could never quite locate precisely. Not sympathy, something more specific than sympathy. The intimacy of the betrayal never made complete sense as a simple act of greed. 30 pieces of silver is not an adequate motive for a man who spent years in daily proximity to Jesus, who heard the same teachings as the other disciples, who was trusted enough to handle the group's finances. The kiss in the garden, chosen deliberately, not accidental, always seemed like it contained more than you were given access to. That persistent unease was not confusion. It was a correct perception, waiting for the context it needed. Around 180 CE, Irenaeus of Lyon, one of the most systematically influential church fathers of the 2nd century, wrote a text called Adversus Haereses, meaning against heresies. In it, he explicitly describes and condemns a Gospel of Judas being actively circulated among Gnostic communities. Not fringe, not obscure, actively read, referenced and considered authoritative. Irenaeus wrote against it specifically because of what it claimed about Judas, who he was, what he understood, and why he acted as he did. The condemnation is on record. The document survives. And the question it immediately raises is this: what was in that text that required the most organized theologian of 180 CE to identify it by name as a heresy in one of the foundational works of early Orthodox Christianity? If this is the kind of knowledge that has always felt like it was waiting for you, the history behind what you were taught, the texts that didn't make it through the selection process, subscribe to this channel. This is exactly where that work continues. Irenaeus describes the Gospel of Judas as a text used by Gnostic communities who venerated figures the Orthodox tradition condemned. His language is sharp and specific. This Gospel presents Judas not as a betrayer, but as the disciple who possessed deeper knowledge than the rest. And in 180 CE, that framing was already dangerous enough to warrant systematic theological opposition. The inversion here is worth sitting with. The act of writing against heresies, of dedicating chapters to condemning a specific text, is itself proof that the text was circulating widely enough to require that response. The suppression of the Gospel of Judas did not begin with silence. It began with the loudest possible condemnation, committed to writing by one of the most authoritative voices in early Christianity. Somewhere in Egypt, near a town called Minya in the mid-1970s, farmers found a limestone box buried in the earth near a cliff face. Inside was a leather-bound codex, ancient, fragile, written in Coptic. The people who found it were not archaeologists, not scholars of early Christian history. They were farmers who had stumbled onto a buried object that had been in the ground for approximately 15 centuries. What they held in their hands was the physical manuscript that contains the Gospel of Judas, the text that Irenaeus had condemned by name 1700 years earlier, and that had somehow survived everything arrayed against it. They did not know what they were holding. They knew it looked old. They sold it. The manuscript entered the illegal antiquities market, the shadow economy that moves ancient objects from excavation sites through private collectors and dealers to auctions, with no documentation, no chain of custody, and no legal protection for the artifacts. The codex changed hands multiple times through the 1980s and 1990s. It was stored in a bank-safe deposit box in a small town in New York for years, at humidity levels that were not low enough. By the time a conservator named Frieda Chakos-Nussberger acquired it in 2000 and arranged for professional conservation, the manuscript had deteriorated into hundreds of individual fragments. What survived was barely readable. What survived was enough. Think for a moment about what that survival represents. A text that Irenaeus was already condemning in 180 CE, which means it had been circulating long enough before that for him to categorize it as a heresy requiring systematic opposition, had managed to survive the period of consolidation that followed Nicaea in 325 CE, survived the decades when Athanasius was issuing his lists of what counted as scripture and what did not, survived 15 centuries in the Egyptian ground, survived decades in the antiquities market, survive the deterioration of a bank vault, and emerge, barely, in the hands of people who could read it. Something about the survival of this text resists being accounted for entirely by accident. So what does the Gospel of Judas actually say? Not what critics say about it, not the summary version designed to position it as an interesting historical curiosity, not the framing that absorbs it into a technical debate among specialists. What does the text itself say, in the specific passages that bear most directly on who Judas was, what he understood, and what the crucifixion was actually meant to accomplish in the cosmological framework this gospel operates within? Because the answer to that question is not what you have been prepared to expect. And once you hear it, the Judas story, the version you were given, will not sit quite the same way again. If what we're uncovering here is landing with you as more than historical curiosity, if it feels like a piece of something you always knew was incomplete, write in the comments, "I read the hidden gospel." In the Gospel of Judas, Jesus appears to his disciples while they are gathered together, performing a Eucharistic ritual, offering a prayer over bread. He observes them, and then he laughs. Not gently, not warmly. The text says, he laughed when he found them gathered in this act of devotion. The disciples are disturbed and ask why he is laughing at what they consider a solemn act of worship. His response is the first layer of what this text contains. He tells them that they are not praising their God in that prayer. He tells them that what they are directing their devotion toward is not who they think it is. The standard frame for understanding Jesus' ministry is that he taught his disciples a path to the God of Israel, the Creator, the Father, the ultimate source. In the Gospel of Judas, the framework is radically different. When the disciples describe a vision they have seen, a great house, a great altar, priests offering sacrifice, Jesus responds not with affirmation, but with correction. He tells them that the God being worshipped at that altar is the God of the material world, the architect of physical creation, but not the ultimate divine reality. The Gnostic cosmology underlying this text makes a precise distinction that the canonical Gospels do not make. Not everything called God is the same God. Let that stay with you, because it is not a peripheral point. It is structural. The disciples in the Gospel of Judas are not portrayed as malicious. They are sincere. They wake up every day and direct their spiritual practice toward what they genuinely believe is the highest divine reality. And Jesus, in this gospel, observes that sincerity with full knowledge and tells them, with apparent compassion, that they are sincere in the wrong direction. If you have ever felt a quiet unease about inherited religious forms, a sense that the sincerity is real, but the framework might be incomplete, this text speaks directly to that unease from 1700 years ago, in the words it preserved. One disciple steps forward. One stays when the others pull back from the full weight of what Jesus is implying. One has been watching closely enough to understand that the laughter was not cruelty. It was recognition of something the others were not yet equipped to see. One is already operating from a different understanding than the other 11, and the text shows this through behavior rather than declaring it outright. It shows him still present when the others cannot hold the full picture. It shows the kind of perception that does not retreat from a truth simply because that truth displaces a comfortable assumption. And then Jesus addresses him directly. Jesus tells Judas to step away from the others. The text is specific. Step away from the others, and I shall tell you the mysteries of the kingdom. It is possible for you to reach it, but you will grieve a great deal. Notice the precision of that instruction. Not the other 11 disciples, Judas. And the reason Jesus gives for singling him out is significant. It is possible for Judas to reach the kingdom, the true divine reality, but the path will involve grief. In the canonical Gospels, that grief is the guilt of a betrayer. In the Gospel of Judas, that grief looks like something entirely different, the weight of carrying knowledge that no one else around you possesses and that the historical record will not allow you to explain. For 2,000 years, the intimacy between Jesus and Judas, the closeness that makes the canonical betrayal feel so devastating, has been read as the measure of the treachery. The closer you were, the deeper the sin of turning against that relationship. The kiss in the garden is the signature of ultimate betrayal, precisely because of the tenderness of the gesture chosen to mark the moment. In the Gospel of Judas, that same intimacy is read through the completely opposite lens. The closeness was not the setup for a betrayal. It was the evidence of a relationship deep enough to carry the weight of a private commission that no one else could understand and that no one else would have been willing to accept. If this content is speaking to you, let me know by liking this video. It helps more people find this work at exactly the moment they're ready for it. Jesus says to Judas, "You will exceed all of them," not, "You will be punished more severely than all of them," not, "You will fall further than all of them." You will exceed all of them. In the context of this text, in the cosmological framework it operates within, exceeding the other disciples is not a dark irony. It is a statement about spiritual perception. The 12 in this gospel are devoted but limited. They are worshipping in the direction of the wrong divine, without perceiving the ultimate reality above it. Judas alone has the perception to grasp what is actually happening. To exceed them is to see further. To see further is to be entrusted with more. And what he is about to be entrusted with is the act that makes the crucifixion cosmologically intelligible. What does it mean to see further in the framework of this text? To answer that, you need to understand what the Gospel of Judas assumes is actually happening inside a human body, and what the crucifixion was cosmologically meant to accomplish. Because, in the Gnostic reading, the body is not simply a vessel designed by a loving God for the fullness of human experience. The body is a specific kind of container operating within a specific kind of cosmic architecture, an architecture that most people, in this framework, are not aware they are living inside. And once you understand that architecture, the phrase, "You will exceed all of them," becomes far more specific than a vague compliment. The Gnostic cosmology underlying the Gospel of Judas does not begin with creation as an unambiguous act of divine love. It begins with a structural problem. The material world, in this framework, was not created by the highest God, the ultimate divine reality, sometimes called the monad or the invisible spirit. It was created by an intermediary, being the Gnostics called the demiurge, a lesser divine figure who fashioned the material cosmos in imitation of higher reality, but without the full picture. The demiurge is not evil in the simple sense. It is limited. It believes itself to be the highest God. It is not. And the world it created reflects that fundamental misunderstanding at every level of its structure. Inside every human being, in this cosmological framework, there is something that does not belong to the material order the demiurge constructed. The Gnostic term for it is pneuma, the divine spark, a fragment of genuine divine reality compressed into a body made of matter. The body is not the self, the body is the vessel or the prison. It belongs to the lower order. The pneuma belongs to the order above. And the entire purpose of genuine spiritual knowledge, what the Gnostic tradition calls gnosis, direct knowing, is to become aware of the distinction between what you are made of and who you actually are. The body can be shed. The pneuma cannot be extinguished. In this cosmological framework, death is not primarily a punishment. It is not the wages of sin in the sense that institutional Christianity developed that teaching. Death is a threshold, a point at which the pneuma is either freed from the material vessel or remains entangled in the lower order, depending on what the bearer of that spark understood during their life. This is why the manner of crossing that threshold matters so deeply in the Gospel of Judas. The question is not simply whether Jesus died, it is what the conditions of that death accomplished, and whether the person who facilitated those conditions understood what they were actually doing at the level of cosmic mechanics. The Gospel of Judas contains a precise statement that is the interpretive center of the entire text. Jesus says to Judas, "You will sacrifice the man that clothes me. Not, you will betray me. Not, you will hand me over to be destroyed. You will sacrifice the man that clothes me." The body is the clothing. The divine is what is wearing it. The sacrifice is not a destruction. It is the act of removing the garment to allow what was inside it to ascend unimpeded. In this single sentence, the entire moral architecture of Judas as betrayer collapses. What was being requested was not treachery. It was the precise, deliberate participation in an act of liberation. If you've been sitting with questions like these about what the tradition preserved and what it excluded, and what that means for how you understand your own relationship to the sacred, I left something for you in the first pinned comment. It's for those who are ready to go deeper than the surface-level version of these histories. Every element of the canonical betrayal, the identification to the authorities, the kiss in the garden, the handover, is read in institutional Christianity as the freely chosen actions of a man who sinned catastrophically against the person who trusted him most. The Gospel of Judas reads those same actions as obedience. Not obedience to the temple, not to Rome, not to greed. Obedience to an explicit request made privately by Jesus himself, with full understanding of what it would require. The act is identical in both versions. The moral universe surrounding that act is completely different, and the tradition that survived to shape 2,000 years of understanding Judas was not the only one that had read those events. The most trusted disciple, the one who understood when the others did not, the one who could carry what no one else in the room was equipped to carry, the one entrusted with the act that would look from the outside like the worst thing a person can do to someone they love, who carried it alone, without the ability to explain, without a record of the private conversation, except for a text that would be buried for 1,700 years. And then whose name became, in every language the story traveled through, the single word people reach for when they want to describe the most complete and final form of human betrayal possible between two people who were close. Why did this alternative reading require Irenaeus to write against it so extensively? What was the specific theological threat the Gospel of Judas represented to the tradition consolidating in 180 CE? The answer is structural. In the Gnostic reading, the mechanism by which the crucifixion accomplished its purpose is not guilt, not betrayal, not the weight of human sin transferred to a sacrificial death. The mechanism is knowledge, gnosis. The person who facilitated the liberation of the divine spark was the person who understood what was actually happening at the cosmological level. And that premise, gnosis as the operative mechanism rather than institutional mediation, is directly incompatible with a religious structure that requires clergy, canon and hierarchy to stand between the individual and the divine. The canonical narrative of betrayal and redemption depends on Judas as a free-choice villain in a very specific way. The entire theological architecture of guilt and atonement that institutional Christianity built on the crucifixion requires someone to have sinned badly enough to trigger the events that followed, freely, culpably, with full moral responsibility. Judas, as freely choosing betrayer, is not a peripheral detail in that architecture. It is load-bearing. Remove it and you change not just the story of one disciple, you change the mechanism by which sin, guilt, sacrifice and forgiveness are understood to operate in the tradition. The Gospel of Judas does not simply rehabilitate Judas. It displaces the entire theological scaffolding that his condemnation was constructed to hold up. Consider the implications of a version of events in which Judas was not a freely choosing sinner, but a specifically chosen disciple carrying out a private commission received directly from Jesus. In that version, the kiss in the garden is not the signature of betrayal, it is the completion of an assignment. The 30 pieces of silver become irrelevant to the moral weight of the act because the act was not motivated by the silver. The narrative of guilt that made Judas the most condemned figure in Western civilization rests on the premise that he chose freely and chose catastrophically wrong. The Gospel of Judas says he chose under instruction and chose with the most complete understanding of what was happening of anyone in the room. And something else collapses alongside Judas's specific reputation. If Judas was instructed, if the act was commission rather than betrayal, then the tradition that portrayed him as a betrayer was not simply mistaken about one disciple. It was actively suppressing an alternative reading of the crucifixion that would lead anyone who heard it to ask different questions about the nature of salvation, the role of gnosis, the function of the institutional church, and who actually has access to divine reality. The tradition that made Judas into a symbol of betrayal is the same tradition that declared the Gospel of Judas heretical. You are not observing a neutral historical disagreement. You are watching a power structure defend its own founding narrative. The architects of early Christian orthodoxy, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Tertullian, were not writing in a climate of calm theological diversity. Multiple versions of Christianity were circulating simultaneously, each claiming apostolic authority, each with its own texts. The condemnations these figures produced were systematic, deliberate, and specific. Tertullian wrote against Gnostic readings directly. Origen built elaborate theological frameworks designed to make the Gnostic alternative not merely wrong, but incoherent. The language was not the language of open debate between equals, it was the language of systematic exclusion. The goal was not to refute the Gnostic readings in public dialogue, it was to remove the conditions under which those readings could survive and be transmitted to the next generation. In 367 CE, Athanasius of Alexandria issued his Festal Letter, the document that listed, for the first time in written form, what would become the 27-book New Testament canon. He also instructed communities under his authority to destroy non-canonical texts. That same year, or within a very narrow window around it, someone near the monastery of Chenoboskion buried a collection of 52 Gnostic texts in a sealed jar in the cliffs at Nag Hammadi, Egypt. Those texts were rediscovered in 1945. The timing of the burial and the letter is not incidental. Athanasius's list established what would be preserved officially. The buried jar preserved what his list had condemned. Both impulses responded to the same historical moment, and together they represent one of the clearest demonstrations in the historical record of how the canonical and the suppressed are two sides of the same institutional act. Why were the Gnostic texts buried rather than destroyed? The destruction option was available. The instruction had been given. Burning would have been simpler and safer for anyone trying to comply with directives from a bishop with the authority of Athanasius. Someone chose not to burn. Someone wrapped the texts carefully in leather, sealed them in a ceramic jar, carried them to a location in the cliffs, and buried them deep enough that they survived 1,500 years. Burial implies something that destruction does not. It implies the possibility of recovery. Someone believed that what they were burying might be needed later, by a reader they would never meet, in a time they could not predict. Picture whoever made that decision. Not an archaeologist, not a scholar, likely a monk from one of the Pachomian monasteries in the area, someone living under ecclesiastical authority, aware of the directive to destroy, choosing at considerable personal risk to preserve rather than comply. The act of wrapping those documents, carrying them to the cliff, and digging the hole is its own form of testimony. Someone understood that the texts they were preserving contained knowledge that could not be allowed to simply disappear, and that the people who would need those texts in the future could not yet be identified. They were preserving something for a reader they would never meet, and trusting that the ground would hold it until that reader arrived. The act of hiding is itself a form of transmission. You hide what you believe will matter later. You hide what you cannot allow to be erased without knowing that something true is being erased. You hide what you cannot defend publicly because the cost of public defense is elimination. Every text that was buried rather than burned, every codex wrapped in leather and placed in a sealed container in Egyptian rock, carries inside it not just the words on the page, but the decision someone made to protect those words against an institution that had the authority to require their destruction. The burial is part of the text. The choice to preserve is inseparable from the message that preservation contains. The Gospel of Judas was not part of the Nag Hammadi collection. It followed a different path. The Codex Chakos, the manuscript that contains it, was found near Minya, not near Nag Hammadi, under circumstances that remain partially unclear. It entered the antiquities market in the late 1970s and changed hands multiple times before being conserved, translated and published by National Geographic in April 2006. The paths of these texts are different. The tradition they preserve is the same, and the fact that both survived through completely different chains of custody, through completely different centuries of risk, carries a weight that is difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence. Between 980 CE, when Irenaeus was already condemning this text by name, and 2006, when it was published in English for a general audience, every generation taught the story of Judas as betrayer, was taught a version from which this gospel was entirely absent. Not absent because it was lost, absent because it was actively excluded. The condemnation was doing its work. And once that condemnation became embedded in institutional authority, it did not need to be actively enforced in every generation. The absence itself became invisible, normal, unremarkable. You cannot notice the missing text if you have never been told a text is missing. That is how the management of a narrative sustains itself across centuries without requiring continuous active effort. The most commonly deployed response to the Gospel of Judas, the academic counter-argument cited in every debunking article, is the translation dispute over a specific Coptic word. In the National Geographic translation published in 2006, Jesus refers to Judas using a term that the translators rendered as spirit, carrying a positive connotation. April DeConnick at Rice University subsequently argued, in a detailed critique published in 2007, that the same Coptic word should be translated as demon, with a negative connotation that shifts the tone of the text's portrayal. This dispute is real and substantive. But there is something important about what both sides agree on, despite that translation difference. Both the National Geographic translation and Deconic's revision agree that Jesus singled Judas out from the other disciples for a private conversation. Both agree that Jesus told Judas he would exceed the others. Both agree that Jesus used the phrase, "You will sacrifice the man that clothes me." The dispute about daimon, spirit or demon, changes the valence of Judas's spiritual status in the text. It does not eliminate the private commission. It does not erase the phrase about exceeding the other disciples. It does not change the fact that Jesus was described as privately instructing Judas on what would happen. The translation dispute concerns the interpretive conclusion. Both versions of the translation agree on the actions the text describes. Notice what the translation dispute actually demonstrates. If the Gospel of Judas were easily dismissed, if it contained nothing that genuinely challenged the canonical reading, it would not have required a detailed academic debate, attracting significant scholarly attention 17 years after its publication. The dispute itself is evidence of how much is at stake in how this text is read. You do not engage in sustained, careful academic debate about the precise meaning of a single word, unless the precise meaning of that word has significant consequences for a narrative that carries enormous institutional weight. The scholarly controversy around the Gospel of Judas is not evidence against its importance. It is evidence of exactly how threatening its implications are to the tradition that built itself on the canonical version. The Gnostic reading of the Crucifixion is not primarily about sacrifice as payment for sin. It is about liberation as the mechanism of return. The divine spark, the pneuma compressed into a physical body by the architecture of the demiurge's creation, has to exit the body under conditions that allow it to ascend rather than remain entangled in the lower order. In this framework, the manner of death matters. The conditions of the exit matter. Whether the person facilitating those conditions understood the cosmological stakes matters enormously. The Gospel of Judas presents the crucifixion not as a moral transaction between humanity and God, but as a cosmological event, and Judas as the only person in the room who grasped it as such. At some point, you have probably asked, maybe quietly, maybe once, and then set it aside, why an all-knowing God would require his own son to be betrayed, arrested, and publicly executed in order to forgive humanity for things that same all-knowing God had presumably anticipated from the moment of creation. Theology has worked very hard to make that question answerable through the framework of substitutionary atonement. The idea that the debt of sin required a specific kind of payment that only this specific death could satisfy. The Gospel of Judas doesn't answer this through that framework. It dissolves the premise. In the Gnostic reading, the crucifixion is not a payment made to God. It is the release of a divine being from a material container. The Nicene Creed, formalized in 325 CE, resolved the theological disputes of early Christianity in a specific direction. It established a framework in which the crucifixion functions as substitutionary sacrifice, Christ dying for human sin, with a freely choosing betrayer providing the mechanism of that death. That framework became the theological foundation of Orthodox Christianity in the Roman Empire. But before Nicaea met, before the canon was fixed, before the councils convened, there were Christians who read the same events and arrived at a completely different understanding of what had happened. The Council of Nicaea did not end an open theological debate by resolving it through superior evidence. It ended the debate by selecting one position and declaring all others heresy. The Gospel of Judas existed before that selection was made, before Nicaea, Before Athanasius's letter, before the canon existed as a fixed list, before the machinery of Orthodox Christianity had fully consolidated under Roman imperial authority, there were communities of people who called themselves followers of Jesus and who were reading texts, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Judas, that addressed his ministry through frameworks entirely different from what eventually became enforced orthodoxy. Those communities were not fringe innovators inventing new religions. They were early readers working with early sources, operating before anyone had officially decided which readings would be allowed to survive and which ones would be condemned as heresy. What did the early Gnostic communities actually believe about the forces governing the material world? The Gospel of Judas uses the term archons, a Greek word meaning rulers or authorities, to describe the cosmic administrators of the lower order of reality. These are not simply angels or demons in the familiar sense. They are structural elements of the cosmological architecture the demiurge constructed. Their role is to maintain the material order, which, in this framework, means maintaining the conditions under which divine sparks remain compressed in physical bodies, unaware of their origin and destination. The archons are not malicious in a simple way. They are the mechanism by which the material world perpetuates its own logic of forgetting what it originally was. The Gnostic cosmology underlying the Gospel of Judas describes layers of divine reality arranged in a specific hierarchy. At the apex, the invisible spirit, the monad, the unknowable highest God, the ultimate divine source from which all genuine reality emanates. Below it, a series of divine emanations, the most significant of which in Scythian Gnostic tradition is Barbelo, a divine feminine principle, the first thought of the invisible spirit. Further down, the demiurge, the creator of the material world, who works at several removes from the highest reality and who mistakes his own creative power for ultimate divine authority. And below the demiurge, the archons, the material cosmos, and the physical bodies they administer. In this cosmological framework, Jesus is not primarily a sacrifice designed to pay a debt owed to God. He is a divine being, an aeon in the Gnostic technical sense, who descended into the material order by temporarily animating a physical body. His mission was not to suffer and die as payment. His mission was to demonstrate the path of return, the mechanics by which a being compressed into matter could recover awareness of its divine origin and ascend back through the layers to the reality above the demiurge's construction. The crucifixion in this reading is the completion of that demonstration, and the person who enabled the final step of that completion was Judas, specifically because he understood what the step was. The archons, the administrators of the material order, believed they were eliminating a threat when they participated in the events leading to the crucifixion. In the logic of the lower order, removing the physical vessel that Jesus was inhabiting meant removing the disruption his presence created. What they were actually accomplishing, in the full Gnostic reading, was precisely the opposite of what they intended. They were facilitating the liberation they were trying to prevent. The divine spark they were trying to suppress was released by the very act they used to suppress it. The archons were the instruments of their own defeat. Judas was the one who understood this clearly enough and fully enough to participate with intention. Picture what that required of him, carrying the weight of a private assignment given in a conversation no one else witnessed, with implications no one else in his immediate community could comprehend. Walking into the garden, knowing what the kiss would look like from the outside, knowing what it would be called, knowing that the record of the private commission, the conversation preserved only in the Gospel of Judas, would either disappear entirely or be condemned or survive only barely and illegally for 1700 years in a deteriorating leather codex in the Egyptian ground. The assignment required not just obedience, It required the willingness to be permanently misread by history while carrying the knowledge that you had acted with complete precision. And then Judas existed in the aftermath, in a world where every other reader of the same events read them as betrayal, where his name, moving from community to community through every language the story traveled, became a synonym for the worst thing a human being can do to someone who trusted them, where children were named anything but Judas for the entire subsequent span of Western civilization, where Dante placed him in the innermost circle of hell, where the visual tradition built his image in shadow and coin counting across centuries, all of it resting on a historical record from which the other version, the version of the private commission, the text that preserved the conversation, had been successfully removed. No defense available in the historical record, no court of appeal, no preserved testimony of the private conversation except this one text, condemned within a century of its circulation, buried for 1,500 years, deteriorating in a vault, reassembled from hundreds of fragments, no contemporary voice saying, "He was asked." He understood precisely what he was doing. He carried out an instruction given to him specifically because he was the only disciple equipped to understand what the act would accomplish. 2,000 years of a verdict standing entirely on the side of the record that survived. And the record that survived was the one the institution doing the preserving had selected, authorized, and transmitted. Is the Gospel of Judas historically accurate in the sense of providing a factual transcript of what Jesus and Judas said in private? That question may be less important than it appears, even understood as theological interpretation rather than historical record, as a Gnostic community's reading of the Crucifixion's cosmological meaning. It still represents something significant. An early community active before 180 CE, reading the same events as the canonical Gospels and arriving at a completely different moral conclusion. That interpretation existed, it circulated, it was condemned. The question is not only whether the text is historically true, it is what the condemnation tells us about who had the authority to decide what counted as truth and what they needed truth to do. The canonical texts of the New Testament were not transmitted from heaven as a fixed and eternal set. They were assembled through a process, councils, lists, debates, exclusions, authorizations that took place between roughly 100 CE and 400 CE, with the most decisive institutional moments in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries. The people making those decisions were not working from a position of theological neutrality. They were building an institution. They had geographic power bases, political relationships with Roman imperial authority after Constantine's conversion in 312 CE, and specific theological commitments that made certain readings useful and other readings actively threatening. The texts that survived the process are the ones that were compatible with the institution that was being constructed around them. This is not a conspiracy theory, and the distinction matters. A conspiracy requires a small group making secret plans in coordination. What happened to the Gnostic texts is not secret. It is documented. Irenaeus wrote, "Against heresies," and it survives. Athanasius issued his festal letter and it survives. The condemnations are on record. The instructions to destroy non-canonical texts are on record. The suppression is not something that has to be inferred or theorized. It is something that the institutions doing the suppressing wrote down and preserved because they considered it orthodox governance, not secret operation. The institutional management of the Gospel of Judas was conducted openly, in the full light of theological authority. The Codex Chakos traces the full arc of what it means for a text to survive outside institutional protection. Found near Minya in the 1970s, sold through the antiquities black market, deteriorating in a Long Island bank vault for years, eventually acquired by the Mecenas Foundation for Ancient Art in Switzerland in 2000. conserved by scholars and published by National Geographic in April 2006. 1700 years from Irenaeus's condemnation to the day it was available for anyone in the English-speaking world to read. That distance, 180 CE to 2006 CE, is one of the more striking continuities in the history of knowledge that someone decided was too dangerous to allow to circulate freely. When a text is too well documented to destroy completely and too threatening to formally legitimize, the institutional response is neither fire nor endorsement. It is management. Allow the text to exist in the category of academic curiosity. Allow scholars to debate it in specialized journals. Allow a translation dispute to develop that absorbs the public conversation into technical questions about a single Coptic word, and manage it so that the full implications, assembled coherently, placed before a broad audience, connected to the living questions that most people bring to the story of Judas, never quite land with the weight they actually carry. The management of the Gospel of Judas since 2006 has been a demonstration of precisely how effectively that strategy operates. One translation dispute, one technical argument about whether daimon means spirit or demon, one corner of one academic subfield, and on the other side of that dispute, 2,000 years of Judas as the world's most universally recognized symbol of betrayal, completely intact, undisturbed, functioning exactly as the tradition that constructed it needs it to function. The proportionality of that situation, a single Coptic word carrying the weight of an entire alternative reading in the public conversation, is itself a demonstration of how effectively the narrative management has worked. The question was never whether the text would be allowed to exist. It was whether the assembled frame needed to understand the text would be allowed to reach you. What do you do with this? You have heard the argument that Irenaeus was condemning this text in 180 CE. You have heard what the text claims Jesus said to Judas privately. You have heard the cosmological framework within which that private commission makes sense as liberation rather than betrayal. You have heard the documentation of how the alternative reading was suppressed. You have heard the translation dispute that absorbed the post-2006 conversation. The question that remains is not whether the Gospel of Judas is authentic. Scholars accept the Codex Chakos as a genuine ancient document. The question is what it means for you that this version existed, was circulated, was condemned, and is now available to you. Something in you may push back against what this implies. That resistance is worth examining because it is not arbitrary. The implications of the Gospel of Judas extend far beyond Judas's personal reputation. If the act described as the ultimate betrayal was actually an explicit commission from Jesus himself, if the tradition that built 2,000 years of condemnation on that act was working from a deliberately incomplete record, then the questions that follow reach into the moral architecture most people in the Western world inherited without choosing. The framework of guilt, the role of betrayal in the mechanism of salvation, the relationship between human sinfulness and divine forgiveness, all of it downstream of a story from which the other version was successfully excluded for 1,700 years. Elaine Pagels, whose scholarship on the Nag Hammadi texts at Princeton helped open the academic world to the breadth of early Christian diversity, was among the scholars who engaged the publication of the Gospel of Judas. Her broader body of work, The Gnostic Gospels, Beyond Belief, The Origin of Satan, documents what the Nag Hammadi discovery revealed, that the Christianity which became dominant in the Roman Empire was one current in a much richer, more varied early movement. The councils did not discover and transmit a singular true Christianity unchanged from the apostles. They selected which version of a genuinely diverse early tradition would be authorized, enforced, and made available to all subsequent generations. The Gospel of Judas does not disprove the existence of Jesus. It does not disprove the crucifixion. It does not require you to abandon whatever relationship to the sacred you have built. What it does is restore a question that the traditions suppressed. What if the disciple who was closest to Jesus' actual intention was the one whose name became a synonym for betrayal? That is not a question about atheism or historical skepticism. It is a question about reading, about which version of a story was allowed to reach you, who made that decision, and what they needed the story to accomplish for the institutional structure they were building. The text exists. The question it raises is now yours. For 2,000 years, the standard reading has been, the closer you were to Jesus, the greater the sin of turning against that proximity. The intimacy made the betrayal worse, not better. In the Gospel of Judas, the same intimacy is read from the completely opposite direction. Getting closest is precisely what gave him the private commission. Understanding more fully is precisely what qualified him for the task the other 11 could not carry. The proximity was not the setup for betrayal. It was the qualification for an assignment that could only be given to the disciple who had developed the perception to understand what the assignment was actually for and what it would actually accomplish. The communities that read the Gospel of Judas before 180 CE were not operating outside Christianity. They considered themselves the most precise readers of Jesus' actual teaching. The Scythian Gnostics, the Valentinians, the Cainites that Irenaeus described, these were not groups that rejected Jesus. They had developed detailed, sophisticated, internally coherent theological frameworks for understanding what his ministry meant and what the crucifixion accomplished. Their readings preceded many of the theological formulations that became orthodox doctrine. They were not deviating from an established baseline. They were part of the original diversity from which a baseline was eventually constructed through a process that required the condemnation of everything outside the selected framework. Consider what it means that different communities, working with the same events, arrived at systematically different conclusions, not random variations, but coherent alternative frameworks, each with internal logic, each with different implications for the relationship between the individual and the divine. In the Orthodox framework, the individual requires institutional mediation, a priest, a canon, a sacramental system standing between the person and divine reality. In the Gnostic framework, the operative mechanism is direct knowing, gnosis, which cannot be mediated by an institution, because any institution that claimed to mediate it would be placing itself precisely where the direct knowing is supposed to occur. The theological stakes of that difference were not abstract in 180 CE. They are not abstract now. What was selected for the canon? What was excluded from it? What was declared authoritative and what was declared heretical? What was transmitted through every official channel of Western civilization and what was buried in the cliff face at Nag Hammadi or found falling apart near Minya or deteriorating in a New York bank vault? What was allowed to reach every subsequent generation without interruption, and what survived only by accident in deteriorating leather, through the antiquities market, through the hands of dealers and collectors who had no understanding of what they were handling. The distribution of what survived is itself information. It tells you who was making the decisions and what they needed the surviving record to say and not to say. You found this today. The Gospel of Judas is available. The Codex Chakos has been translated and published. The scholarly literature, including the National Geographic documentation, Deconic's critique, Pagels's contextual scholarship, exists in the public domain. What has not been widely available is not the text. It is the assembled frame that allows the text to be understood as a coherent challenge to the narrative most people received about Judas, and by extension, about the crucifixion's meaning, and about who decided what version of the story would reach you. The text and the frame together are what you are holding right now, and that combination was considerably harder to come by than either piece alone. What does it mean to hold two versions of a sacred story simultaneously, without resolving them into one, without discarding either, without needing an institution to tell you which one is correct? The Gnostic tradition has a specific answer. The answer is gnosis, direct knowing that does not depend on institutional resolution. You can hold the canonical Judas and the Judas of this text in the same moment, because your access to divine knowing is not mediated by which of those readings the institution authorizes. The contradiction between them is not a problem to be solved. It is an opening. It points to exactly the place where the question of who made the selection and why becomes something you carry and examine for yourself. The texts that became the New Testament were not declared canonical in a single moment or by a single authority. The process was gradual, contested, and geographically uneven. Different regions of early Christianity used different collections of texts for different periods of time. The list Athanasius issued in 367 CE was not universally accepted immediately. It took additional councils, further debates, and several more decades before anything approaching a stable canon existed across the tradition. Every decision in that process was made by specific people in specific communities, responding to specific pressures, theological, political, institutional. The canonical texts did not emerge from the process because they were the only valid readings available. They emerged because they were the readings useful to the tradition that was winning, the deepest thread running through the Gnostic tradition, through the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Philip, the full breadth of the Nag Hammadi collection, is not that the institutional church is wrong and the heretics are right. That framing is too simple, and it reproduces the same binary the institutional response depends on. The deepest teaching is that direct knowing, gnosis, cannot be delegated. It cannot be preserved in a canon and transmitted through a priesthood as a substitute for the direct encounter with divine reality that the canon points toward. The tradition that buried the Gnostic texts understood this clearly. A structure built on institutional mediation cannot coexist with a framework in which institutional mediation is structurally unnecessary. One of them had to go. The Gospel of Judas ends before the crucifixion. The text stops with Judas handing Jesus over to the authorities. The arrest, the trial, the death, none of it is narrated. What survives is the private teaching, the commission, and then the act of handover. Then the text ends. In the canonical Gospels, the silence that follows is filled with guilt and suicide. Judas returning the silver, declaring he has betrayed innocent blood, and hanging himself. The Gospel of Judas does not fill the silence that way, because in the cosmological framework this text operates within, there is nothing to fill. The commission was fulfilled. The liberation was accomplished. The task was complete. The silence carries completion, not collapse. In canonical Christianity, the silence after Judas's act contains the most complete moral collapse in the tradition. The moment guilt becomes unbearable, the moment the 30 pieces are thrown back, the moment a man recognizes the full weight of his sin and cannot live with it, that silence is the definitive statement on Judas's moral condition. In the Gospel of Judas, the same silence carries an entirely different quality. Not the silence of guilt, not the silence of a man who has just realized the enormity of what he has done, the silence of a task performed according to instruction, with full understanding of its purpose, by the only person who was equipped to carry it to completion without retreating. A completed task, a misunderstood name, 1,700 years of a verdict that the most relevant counter-evidence, the text describing what Judas was actually asked to do, was buried in the desert to avoid. 2,000 years of the word Judas, functioning in every language as the single most immediately recognizable symbol of ultimate betrayal. Children named anything else. Dante placing him in the innermost circle of hell. The visual tradition building his image in shadow and coin counting across centuries. And underneath all of it, in the ground in Egypt, in a deteriorating codex, in a text that Irenaeus was condemning before most of the canonical framework had fully solidified, a different account, still there, still recoverable. The Gospel of Judas is publicly available. The Codex Chakos has been translated and published by National Geographic. The scholarly debates, the Deconic critique, the subsequent academic exchanges, all of it is in the public domain. What has not been widely assembled is the frame connecting those pieces into a coherent challenge to the canonical narrative you were given. The text alone is not sufficient. You need the Gnostic cosmological framework to understand why Jesus' private instruction makes internal sense. You need the documented timeline of suppression, Irenaeus at 180 CE, Nicaea at 325 CE, Athanasius at 367 CE, to understand that the absence of this version from your inherited story was deliberate, institutionally executed, and written down by the people doing it. Now that you know this text exists, now that you have the documented condemnation, the cosmological framework, the actual quoted phrase from Jesus to Judas, the timeline of institutional suppression, and the path the Codex followed from the Egyptian ground to your screen, reading the canonical Judas story becomes a different experience. The story does not disappear. The kiss in the garden does not disappear. The 30 pieces of silver do not disappear. What changes is what they sit inside. They now exist alongside the awareness that the version that survived was selected, that the version that was buried has also survived, and that you are among the first generations in 1700 years with access to both simultaneously. If you stayed until the end, write in the comments, "I hold both versions." I've placed another lesson on your screen right now, your next step into what they kept hidden. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.